Okay, so somebody asked me to make a video explaining the history and origins of left-wing anti-Semitism. And this, in my opinion, is one of the most pertinent conversations and histories to understanding anything about what is happening in our world today, because most people know the right-wing history of anti-Semitism, at least at a basic level, Nazism, fascism, but most people have no idea about the secret history of left-wing anti-Semitism. And because they don't know, it is defining everything about the world around us today. So here's what I'm going to do, okay? I'm going to link a more than 100-year history happening all over the world in one unbroken chain of events that starts with a crumpled up piece of paper found in a German embassy in Paris that leads to the creation of the State of Israel, the rise of Nazism in Germany, the creation of the anti-Zionist movement in Soviet Russia, the rise of anti-Semitism in the Middle East, the infiltration among the Western left, and then ends with Huda Beauty telling her millions strong audience that the Jews are controlling the world and behind every atrocity in history. Now, of course, she doesn't say Jews, she says Israel while describing events that happened before the creation of the State of Israel. And the reason that I mention her specifically is because this is my penny drop moment that I finally put that 100 plus year history together. So you are going to go through the journey of discovery with me and have that moment where you literally get chills, like terror chills, when you see it play out right in front of your eyes and you say to yourself, oh my God, it's here. Okay, so our story begins in 1894 in Paris, the Dreyfus affair. So what happens in 1894 is that this piece of paper is discovered in the German embassy wastebasket, revealing French military secrets. But the question is, who done it, right? Who was guilty of it? Now, immediately, the accusation goes to a man named Alfred Dreyfus. Why? Because Alfred Dreyfus is Jewish. He was a member of the French military. So Dreyfus is accused and indicted of this crime of treason without essentially any evidence that suggests that he did it. The French military fabricate all of this evidence to indict him, and he's sentenced to life imprisonment in Devil's Island in solitary confinement. Now, the first question is, why would the French military do this? Why would they go to these lengths to falsify this evidence to indict a Jewish man? And this is something that Goebbels, the chief propagandist of the Nazi party, said himself, that it might not be factually true, but it expresses a deeper truth. So when the French military is fabricating this evidence against Dreyfus, you can't understand this by saying to yourself, oh, so these people knew that they were evil and they knew he was innocent, and that's what anti-Semitic hate looks like. No. What it looks like is that they said to themselves, he's obviously guilty. We know he's guilty because he's Jewish. They're not loyal. They're fifth columns. Of course he's guilty of treason. And because they have this underlying myth, okay, that becomes an emotional truth. And so they fabricated this evidence to prove something that they believed was true because of his identity. So 2 years after Dreyfus is indicted, it's now 1896, Dreyfus is in solitary confinement, he's on Devil's Island, and guess what? We discover that he isn't actually guilty. Why? Well, we already knew that. But the reason why is because the spying continues. So the new head of French counterintelligence, Picot, discovers that the real culprit behind this entire time is this guy called Esterhazy. So he brings this information to the French military, and the French military try to cover it up. They're trying to basically maintain their legitimacy, and this is a really, really, really awful and damaging thing to come to the public's attention. In any case, this Esterhazy guy is put on trial, instantly acquitted, determined that he's not guilty. For sure it was still this Dreyfus guy. Okay, after the trial where the real culprit is acquitted, there is this one journalist whose name is Emile Zola, and he's absolutely furious. He's furious because he knows the evidence shows that Dreyfus is innocent. So why are they pushing his guilt? Why are they covering up for the guy who really did it? And why are they demanding that we all believe that this Jewish man is guilty just because he's Jewish? So this guy is what you call the righteous among nations. This guy is the righteous among nations because he knows that if he publishes this article exposing the cover-up, he knows he can be prosecuted for libel. So what he does is that he writes an open letter to the French president saying, bro, Dreyfus is innocent. This is a massive cover-up. So this article, which he's printed on the front page of a French newspaper, it's called Je accuse, okay, which means I accuse. Now this has become a modern metaphor. You may have heard it when somebody is essentially attacking an institution as corrupt. You say Je accuse, which means I'm accusing you of institutional corruption. So after Je accuse comes out, this article comes out, French society is now divided into two. Wait for this. Are you ready for this? Are you actually ready for this? The Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards. The entire French society divided into two groups. One was the pro-Jewish person, the other one was the anti-Jewish person, and none of them said pro or anti-Jewish person. They used a substitute word, which was anti-Dreyfusards. I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm just an anti-Dreyfusard. Pro-Dreyfusard say that individual rights and justice is important. You cannot persecute this man just because he's Jewish. It's so unfair. And then you have the anti-Dreyfusards, who are the right at this time, the right wing, and they're saying, for sure, this guy did it. He's Jewish. What eventually happens is that the president finally, a few years later, pardons Dreyfus. Okay, so Dreyfus is exonerated. Yay. Picard returns to France. The guy who actually did it escapes the country, and the person who fabricated the evidence finally confesses and kills himself in prison. Okay, so that ends the Dreyfus scandal. Now, how do we go from this to everything else I described? Well, let's first talk about how this actually leads to the creation of the State of Israel. So Theodor Herzl, who is the founder of the Zionist movement, he is a journalist who happens to be in Paris at the time covering the Dreyfus affair. Now, this is actually just chilling to think about how history is shaped by these tiny moments, because listen to this, okay? Herzl is standing in the middle of Paris in 1895 when Dreyfus is having his public degradation ceremony, okay? So his badges are being torn off, his sword is being broken in half. He's telling everybody, I'm innocent, I'm being accused because I'm Jewish. In France, Jews have just been given equal rights after the French Revolution. It's the only place in Europe, the only place where Jews are currently recognized as equal citizens. Herzl is standing in the middle of the safest place for Jews in the world, and all around him, he's hearing people chant, "Death to the Jews." Okay, this is the watershed moment in history where Herzl says to himself, oh my God, I am in the safest place in the world for Jews, and everybody is saying death to the Jews. Where are we safe? Oh my gosh, that just really emotionally overwhelmed me. Okay. That becomes the basis for which he decides. And this is really also very important to understand, because before that, Herzl was somebody that strongly believed in assimilation. He actually believed that Jews should convert to Christianity to assimilate, to escape persecution. And this was the moment for him deciding that we need our own state. And guess what? This was before Nazi Germany. He's foreshadowing what's coming. He knew. So now we move forward to 1903 in Russia. It's a few years after Dreyfus has been exonerated. And what's happening in France at the time is that there's this massive, massive wave of anti-Semitism that's coming out of the Dreyfus affair. And this is sweeping across all of Europe. Now, what you have to understand about what's happening in Russia in 1903 is integral to how this story develops. So in Russia in 1917, we have the first socialist revolution in history, the Bolshevik Revolution, which happens in 1917. But before we get there, what happens before 1917? Russia is under Tsarist rule, which is essentially a monarchy or a supreme leader of sorts. And in the years preceding the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, workers are demanding equal rights. Now, let me just say, if you know anything about me, or what I've been talking about, you know that I describe socialism as the deadliest ideology in human history. But it's also important to understand that these movements don't arrive or convince the masses by telling you what they are and what history shows they are. They arrive because the masses are dissatisfied with the conditions of the time. And obviously under Tsarist Russia, Russians are massively dissatisfied. They're experiencing extreme food shortages following World War I. The conditions for workers are atrocious. People are dying of disease, illness, famine. And this is where socialism is so often born. This is the utopia we can create through this socialist revolution. So in the decade preceding 1917, there's this burgeoning Marxist socialist movement. So the Tsarist regime is thinking to itself, how do I suppress this socialist revolution? So the Okhrana, which is the secret police under the Tsar, looks out into the world, looks into Europe, and sees this massive episode of anti-Semitism that has come out of the Dreyfus affair. And the secret police say to themselves, we've got it. All we have to do is say that this socialist revolution that is rising in Russia is a Jewish movement. Why? Because they see that the world hates Jews. Dreyfus shows to them that there's this massive opportunity to capitalize on anti-Semitism to suppress this rising revolution in Russia. So the Okhrana creates this forgery, this document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. What is it? It is, like I said, it's a forgery, and it is directly lifted from this text called Dialogue in Hell between Machiavelli and Montesquieu. That's it. So essentially what they do with this document is that this is a satire about Napoleon III and his desire to take over France, okay? So what they do is they substitute Napoleon III for the Jews, and they substitute France for the world. That's it. Just copy and paste, take out those words and substitute them. So instead of Napoleon III wants to take over France, now it reads as Jews want to take over the world, okay? So this document, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, is now disseminated everywhere. And yes, later there was an admission that it was a fabrication. Did that change anything? No, because it has become the foundation of modern anti-Semitism. The idea that the Jews are controlling the world all comes from this one single document, even though it's been debunked. But I wish I could tell you that was the worst of it. I wish I could tell you that was the end of it. Wait until you hear what happens with this document. Okay, so first of all, let me back up and answer something else. What you're probably thinking to yourself is, wait a minute, but are these socialist revolutions Jewish revolutions? Because I've heard that many times before. This is something that for me to explain to you, I actually have to make a separate video on scapegoatism. Because what I'm explaining to you right now is the history, which is very enlightening, but it's never going to be as enlightening as understanding the psychology. And when you understand scapegoat theory, you are going to understand, as well as history, when you understand the history and the psychology, you literally understand everything. So what I'll tell you for now, without getting into that, is this. If Jews are part of any movement, it is called a Jewish movement. That's as simple as you need to understand. Yes, there were Jews in the socialist Bolshevik movement, and yes, there were Jews against it, and yes, there were Jews in the middle. The Jews were everywhere because they were assimilated. With the Bolshevik Revolution, which was led by Lenin, they, said that I think it was his maternal grandfather had Jewish ancestry, but he didn't identify as Jewish. He was an atheist who completely disowned that identity. But they said, oh, Jewish revolution, right? Do you see how that works? Okay, so after the Bolshevik Revolution is successful, this is so important to understanding how these historic elements all link together. So before, the Tsarist regime was warning you through the protocols that the Jews are conspiring to take over the world. Now, the socialist revolution in Russia has just been successful, and the right-wing or the monarchist anti-Semites are now saying to you, see, we told you that the Jews were trying to take over the world. Look at the Bolshevik Revolution, the Jewish Revolution. Okay, so what the Nazis end up calling this is Judeo-Bolshevism. We haven't gotten to the Nazis yet, but now, the early 1900s, this is the rise of Nazi sentiment. So what's so crazy about how these things all intersect is that Hitler uses the protocols as the foundation of Nazi theory. So now Hitler is saying, see, guys, didn't we tell you this document proves that the elders of Zion exist and they made this plan, and the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 in Russia is proving that they really are trying to take over the world. So now this gives rise to another explosive wave of anti-Semitism everywhere, because people were like, oh my God, it was really true. Okay, so that is the basis of how this Russian forgery under the Tsar leads to the rise of anti-Semitism. But you're thinking to yourself, wait, this is Nazi anti-Semitism. We said that this was about left-wing anti-Semitism. Okay, so just wait, because it actually fuels both. So that's where it sort of trails off into Germany, and you know the rest of that story. Okay, so now, staying in Russia, as you know, after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Tsarist regime falls and the socialist regime comes to power. So now we have the Soviet Union in power. And remember how I told you about Theodor Herzl? Okay, so this is all connecting. So Theodor Herzl, after standing in the middle of Paris and hearing people chant death to the Jews, is like, we got to have our own state. So now Israel comes into existence in 1947. Now, the way things are lining up, Soviet Russia is one of the first states to recognize it. In fact, it initially believes that it's going to be an ally. Because what is happening in 1947, at the exact time that Israel comes into existence, it is the beginning of the Cold War. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Israel starts as a socialist state. It at least seems like it's going to take the shape of a socialist state. You have the kibbutzim, which is a small area. I guess now people know because of October 7th, but they have a sort of a small, compact socialist network within Israel that lends itself to the position that maybe Israel is going to take a socialist position. Well, it doesn't. Over time, Israel becomes a much closer ally to the United States. And oh my God, does this piss the Soviet Union off, because the Soviet Union is in the Cold War and it's just lost an ally. So what is the Soviet Union going to do about Israel now? Remember how I told you about the protocols? Well, now the Soviets are using the same document to say that, yes, Jews want to take over the world, but not as socialists, right? Because they're socialists, but as capitalists. Okay, so these two things are overlapping in one moment in time in history. In fascist Germany, the Jew is accused of being the socialist, and in socialist Russia, the Jew is accused of being a fascist. Both stemming from this one document, the protocols. One of them is saying the Jews are taking over the world as socialists. The other one is saying the Jews are taking over the world as capitalists. So what the Soviets do with this document is that they disseminate it everywhere, and this becomes one of the most widely disseminated documents in the Middle East. And they send disinformation agents into the Middle East. Mikhail Pachepa, who is a Soviet defector, says that they conducted around 10,000 disinformation operations to turn the Arab Muslim world against Israel. Remember, this is the Cold War. We want to turn everybody against the Western world by claiming that everyone on the other side of it are these imperialist colonizers who want to destroy your land and take over the world. And so this becomes, the Soviets make this an instrumental part of Marxist theory. So Marxism starts with this framework. Well, this isn't actually something Marx ever said. It develops this way, this framework of oppressed and oppressor. So the oppressor is the capitalist. It's the Western imperialist, right? So the Soviet Union engages in this disinformation campaign that essentially says that, hey, you know, this Zionist movement that was supposed to be about Jewish self-determination during a mass genocide and exodus from all over the world, that isn't actually about Jewish liberation. You know what that is? That is American imperialism. Okay? So this gives birth to the anti-Zionist Soviet propaganda movement. Everything that the Jews are doing to return home is inverted. So the Jews who were once indigenous to this land are now framed as colonizers. The Jews who are escaping mass murder are reframed as the murderers. The Jews who are the most persecuted people in history are reframed as the persecutor as part of the Soviet Cold War disinformation campaign against Israel. And then what happens in 1975 is that the Soviets engage in this disinformation campaign that eventually leads to the UN passing a resolution that essentially says Zionism is racism. Okay? So let me just be very clear about this. Anti-Zionism was created by the Soviet Union. I'm not sure if you really understand what I'm saying. It was a massive disinformation campaign. Now you understand, okay, these are the origins of when people say that Israel's trying to take over the world, but there's never been a manifesto to go beyond their historic borders. And the belief that there's a desire to go beyond their historic borders and to take over the world comes from the protocols of the elders of Zion. So when you hear these left-wing pundits telling everybody, Israel's controlling us, we're occupied by Israel, all of this is Soviet propaganda. What is our society doing? It is organizing around the Jewish people yet again. Remember the Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards? Well, now we have the Zionists and the anti-Zionists. Why are they not organized around the worst actors in the world? Why are they not organized around the worst terrorists, the worst atrocities? And then they'll say, but because I don't know about that. I don't hear about that. Why don't you hear about that? Why is the news not reporting that? Oh, so you're saying that the BBC and, you know, the New York Times and Washington Post are all influenced by this Soviet propaganda? Yes. Yes. I remember seeing this tweet by this prominent anti-Semite on X. I forgot her name. She was Dr. something, maybe Dr. Anna something. Just like the UN passed that resolution saying that Zionism is racism, which by the way was repealed 15 years later. It was repealed at the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. But guess what? 16 years. That was a long enough period to entrench itself in leftist ideology, that the leftists believe that the Jewish returned to their homeland during a genocide where they just wanted to coexist with the current inhabitants of the land was racism. So this woman tweets after, I don't know, the UN said something, and she's like, next they're going to tell us that the institutions are anti-Semitic. And this tweet just gets so many likes. And I'm thinking to myself, my God, how people don't, like, even if you didn't know Dreyfus, even if you didn't know the Soviet Union, even if you didn't know any of this stuff, you would at least know Nazi Germany. You would at least know institutional anti-Semitism under Nazi Germany. But the point is that nobody sees the UN and left-wing organizations that way because they don't know the Soviet history. So they're like, well, how could these left-wing pro-human rights people be anti-Semites? Because that is what has infiltrated their ideology. Soviet disinformation says that the Arab and Muslim worlds are the oppressed and that the US and Israel are the oppressor. So after the Soviet Union disseminates the protocols of the Elders of Zion into the Muslim world to essentially say, hey, the Jews are trying to take over the world, you better rise up and start these revolutions to eliminate Israel. What is really just crazy about how this history all ties together is that you eventually find the protocols where in Hamas's charter comes from Tsarist Russia, ends up in Hitler's Mein Kampf, used as Soviet anti-Zionist disinformation, ends up in Hamas's charter. Every single one of them perpetuating the conspiracy that we have to kill the Jews because they're trying to take over the world. A satire document about Napoleon III. And everybody knows. Everybody knows it's a forgery. So in Hamas's charter, they repeat the protocol's conspiracy. They say the Jews are responsible for World War I, the Jews are responsible for World War II, the Jews control the institutions like the UN, even though the UN passed the resolution to say that Zionism is racism. The Jews control the banks, the Jews control everything, and we have to eliminate Israel to free the world from Jewish oppression. Okay, so what is happening in the United States in the 1960s and 70s? Just all of these events from 1894 are just about to all click together. Okay, so watch this. In the 1960s and 70s in the United States, there is the rise of the Marxist movement and the formation of the New Left. So the New Left essentially is communist in the United States. And believe it or not, they are falling in love with the biggest authoritarian dictators in the world. Falling in love with Stalin, falling in love with Mao, falling in love with Castro. We're talking about the biggest mass murderers in history. Mao is the biggest mass murderer in history. Guess what? The New Left are like, this is us. This is us. These are the movements that we want to bring home. So in the 1960s and 70s, people inherit this Marxist Soviet ideology, and this becomes the basis of modern leftist ideologies. It's socialism, revolutionary socialism versus the imperialists. And who are the Western imperialists? They are, as the Soviet prescribed, the United States and Israel. The oppressor is the Zionist. And that, and all of the sweeping propaganda that came with it, is inherited by the Western left. And this brings us to the aha moment where I finally see Huda Beauty making that video saying, guys, I can't believe it. I just discovered that Israel is responsible for World War I, for World War II, for this, for famine, for that, exactly as Hamas wrote in its charter, exactly as was written in the protocols of the Elders of Zion under Tsarist Russia, a creation in the heat of the anti-Semitism that came off of the back of Dreyfus, which starts with a crumpled up piece of paper found in a wastebasket in a German embassy in Paris in 1894. And that's where our story ends. And that's where I have my moment, where I'm looking at Huda Beauty repeat this, and I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, the Jews are never going to be safe. Because people don't learn history. And so when they go out there and they say, I'm just defending the oppressed, how could anybody be mad at me? All I'm doing is just standing up for the oppressed. Yeah, 90% of the world is going to go, that sounds about right. Because when moral inversion has made you the aggressor, under all circumstances, you can never be oppressed. When Soviet propaganda has made you racist, you can never be the victim of racism. When Soviet propaganda has made you the persecutor, you can't be the persecuted. The reason why this propaganda will continue to be as successful as it is because of something that the communists said that's really important. And Mikhail Pachepa talks about this. They said that for every successful propaganda campaign, there has to be a kernel of truth, and that's what makes it undiscoverable. So essentially, somebody could listen to all of this and say, yeah, but when I'm criticizing Ben-Gvir, right? It's not because of Soviet propaganda. This is exactly the problem with disinformation campaigns. That's true. You can very easily point to Ben-Gvir's behavior and use that as legitimate criticism of Israel. You can point to state policies, war policies that you disagree with, and that can be legitimate criticism of Israel. But what people don't understand is that people who engage in this more often than not are part of a bigger Soviet conspiracy / Nazi conspiracy. And this is why you are now seeing the American left and the American right unify against the Jews, both because of the genealogy of their respective thought lines. On the right, they say the Jews, they don't even use Israel as a disguise. They just say the Jews are responsible for socialism, and this is their plan to take over the world from the protocols. And on the left, they say that the Jew is the Zionist imperialist oppressor, and this is their plan to take over the world from the protocols. And they both meet at this conspiratorial endpoint where the Jew is always the enemy, the Jew is always the fifth column, the Jew is always the manipulator, the Jew is at the center of every tragedy and catastrophe. And that leads me into my next video on scapegoatism, which, like I said, will explain the psychology as a counterpart to this history. God, I'm so exhausted now, but suffice it to say that when you understand this history, you understand, God, that the world is just such a dark place, full of extremely unconscious people who never think that they're complicit in evil, who always think they're fighting the good fight. And that is exactly what Candace Owens said in her conversation with Anna Kasparian when the left and the right met against the Jews and said, we are literal angels fighting demons. Those were her words. Scary stuff, right? I wish I could leave this on a positive note, but unfortunately this history is not very positive. And I will even say something that's more concerning, which is that we've seen the apex, we've seen the height of the fascist anti-Semitic propaganda. We've never seen the height of it in terms of anti-Zionism on the left. So I guess we're all experiencing that together in real time. This is a real chapter in history that we are all living through together. And this is why it's never been more important to make people aware of this history, to make your friends, your loved ones, everyone you know aware of this history, so we don't run the risk of it reaching catastrophe once again. That's all I'll say for now, and then I will come back with my scapegoat video as soon as possible.